will you please turn with me to Genesis chapter 37? Also, if you'd like to follow along with the message outline, you can find that on the church website. Also, it is provided via the link below. For those who don't know me, my name is Joshua Oshring. I'm a part-time associate pastor here at HCC, and I'm going to be talking for the next several sermons here. And we're going to be looking at a guy named Joseph. And now you may recognize the name, and we're going to be looking at the one from the Old Testament. So think the Old Testament story, not the father of Jesus in the New Testament. And Joseph, he's the guy that was shown a little bit of favoritism. His father preferred him over his other brothers, mostly because of who his mother was. He loved his mother the most, and there was a little bit of favoritism there. I'm not saying it was a good thing, just that it was. Because of that, his brothers ultimately, they think, oh, well, we hate him so much, let's kill him. And they decide, you know what, that would hurt their father too much, and they loved their father even in spite of this favoritism. And they decide that instead they're just going to sell him into slavery. So still something bad, but, not as bad as you just outright murder. And then we see, and we'll talk about all this a little bit more later on too, but we see that his new master that he gets sold to accuses him of trying to sleep with his wife, and he has to run away from that situation, and then he eventually gets thrown in jail because of it. And we also see that he deciphers dreams for his fellow cellmates during that time, and also for Pharaoh. And eventually, he becomes a pretty significant leader in the land of Egypt, being second only to Pharaoh himself. And there's a 7-year famine that goes on during this time too. And we see that Joseph through all of this, that he really just trusts God's plan, and he focuses on that. And no matter what his current situation is, he's trusting God to preserve and to redeem his present situations. And now he doesn't really break down or get upset or get angry at God during all this, and instead he has that strong demeanor that just pushes forward and says God's going to work this out for good. And he knows that really God he has a plan, and it's going to be a good plan, and that there's some pretty terrible things that happen to Joseph along the way, but ultimately it's going to be good, and he chooses to trust God. And really, I think there's some key elements that Joseph's story is about, and I really think it's about restoration of relationship, redemption, redeeming of the life circumstances that Joseph had, where ultimately, he's able to save entire nations as well as his own family, and preserve that line of promise through his family, through his brothers, becoming, the 12 tribes of Israel. And really, really prospering that way. And also so there's that preservation, but also it's one of forgiveness, and that's one that we're going to focus on in the next couple of weeks, is that Joseph is able to forgive his brothers, forgive his family for the hardships that they essentially put him through, knowing that God was the one that was in control, and that his only option is to forgive his family and to invite them back and to have that restored relationship. And like I said, we're gonna look at that a little bit more in depth in the weeks to come. But so that's kind of the story of Joseph in a nutshell. And we're going to get to and dive into certain parts, not the whole story of Joseph. So some of those things I mentioned, we're not really going to look at. But I encourage you maybe to read the rest of the story on your own. So we're going to look at chapter 37 today. And I hope that you've turned there with me. And then we'll look at a couple other chapters in the coming weeks. But whatever chapters we don't cover, I encourage you to read them because they're great. And I think it'll help you understand the other chapters as well. So, one of those key points that I mentioned that I think Joseph's story is really about is that redemption aspect, and he really has this story of redemption, and that's what this series title is. So the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at Trust God's Redemption Plan. And we really see Joseph do that, and we're going to look at different aspects of what it means to trust in God's plan. and what that looks like. So if you flip the outline on the back, or if you have it digitally, then on the second page, you can see that this time, this week is on trust God to preserve his people, and we're going to be looking at Genesis 37. And then next time is trust God to point to repentance, and that's in Genesis 44. And the last one is trust God to provide forgiveness. That's Genesis 45. And then at the bottom there in red, you can see I have a key question for the series. What does God offer to those who trust him? And we're going to kind of answer that over the next couple of weeks. And our life response is to trust God's plan to preserve his people, to point to repentance, and to provide forgiveness. So that's where we're going over the next couple of weeks. So let's go ahead and dive into that first one, that first section, and trust God to preserve his people in Genesis 37. And now, throughout Joseph's life, we see that God is protecting a promise that he made to Israel. And that's really Jacob. It's the same guy. He had a bit of a name change. And really, God reiterates his promise to Abraham. So it's the same promise that he gave to Abraham, and now he's passing it on to Jacob as one of Abraham's descendants. And it's this promise of a land, a people, a legacy that will be everlasting. And that's what God promised Abraham. That's what he promised Jacob. And how could Jacob have that if, his sons are not going to be prosperous, not survive through the famine, and all that good stuff. So we really see in these first few chapters these first few verses of chapter 37 that God is preserving his people and that promise, which now that leads us to that first section there. Choose to believe God's plan. And believe specifically God's plan and promises. And so that promise that we talked about, that's, it's mentioned here in the first couple of verses. And so 1 through 4 says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And that's the land that was promised to them. And this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and sons of Silpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. We see that God's plan here, he brings it up a little bit, and we see that it's that Joseph, he's not very popular amongst his brothers, and we can kind of see the foreshadowing here of what God's plan is, and that it's probably not going to end up good at first for Joseph, seeing as they don't really like Joseph. They're not as fond of him as their father is. In fact, their father gives them preferential treatment, gives them a robe. He listens to bad reports about him, or about the other brothers from Joseph, and he's kind of like his inside man on what the other brothers are doing. And this is fostering this hatred for Joseph, and really God uses that and uses this bad situation and turns it into something good later on. But right now we're kind of still in that bad, and it's still a part of God's plan. God is still using this to accomplish his purpose, and we're going to see that his plan and his purpose might not always line up with what we think it should, or how he doesn't always work things out the way that we think he should. But we can trust that his plan is always good. And Joseph really does trust that, and he trusts that plan. And we see that in the next few verses, and we see his demeanor towards his brothers. It doesn't change anything. He probably knew his brothers didn't like him. I'm sure they didn't hide it. I mean, if you have a sibling and you ever get into a fight with a sibling, you probably aren't very good at hiding it from them that you're disappointed or something of that nature. So Joseph, he chooses to trust God's plan, even in the point to that point where he is willing to bear the bad news about what the other brothers are doing, even if that means that the brothers are going to hate him even more, and there's probably going to be some consequences there. That kind of leads us to the next question, or to the next point. Believe God's plan even if you disagree, and that's that next point on the bullet or the outline there. That and verses 5 through 8, they say, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Here we see that Joseph's brothers, not surprisingly, they're not really in favor of God's plan at this present moment. Because God, through this dream, He's revealing to Joseph that He's revealing what's going to happen eventually, and we're going to see that in one of in a couple of weeks. But He's revealing what's going to happen really years later. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen the next week. But it's really years later down the road. And I don't know if Joseph fully understood what this was going to look like or how it was all going to pan out, but we really see that still he's going to continue to trust God, and he's going to trust his plan. He's going to trust that what God revealed to him in that dream is true, and so he's going to continue to carry on the way that he has been and trust that God's got that good plan. And his brothers, they're really doing the opposite. See, they disagree at this point. God says Joseph's going to rule over the family, and they say, yeah, that's not going to happen. And basically, God's saying that Joseph's going to have a position of authority over his brothers and his not only his siblings, but also his parents. And that just seems like a weird scenario. I mean, think about it this way. I'm a younger brother. I think if I walked up to my brother and told him that I was in charge, he probably wouldn't like that too much, and it probably wouldn't go over very well. And I don't think I would end up being in charge. So this is kind of a weird scenario. It's it's a flip. The leader of the family is often the one who's the oldest, and not the one who's the youngest in this case. And if you're familiar with the story, you know that this is exactly what's going to happen, is that Joseph is put in a place of authority, and the brothers end up under that authority willingly and unknowingly, and it is fulfilled, and God's plan is fulfilled. So Joseph has to trust that now, even though he's going to go through some pretty terrible things. And so that leads us to the next thing, is that we got to believe God's plan is good. So believe God's plan is good. That's the next point on the outline. Because even if bad things happen, we still have to trust that God's plan is good. Verses 9 through 11 say, Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And now here we have seemingly almost exactly the same thing. We have another dream that's saying almost exactly the same thing. And as we're going to see later, I think this dream, the reason why it comes up twice is it's referring to that time where Joseph is ruling in Egypt. He's second only to Pharaoh. And he in these two dreams, God's showing that Joseph is going to play a crucial role in protecting his family, not just from starvation, but also preservation of that promised line. As we talked about, if God promised Abraham that he was going to have many descendants, and then he reaffirmed that promise through Jacob, and Jacob's sons all died of famine, how would that line of promise be preserved? And so I think that's really what God's revealing here, is that he's going to use Joseph to fulfill that promise and to keep that promise moving forward and to preserve that. Now, with all that being said, that sounds all good, and that, Joseph's going to preserve the line of promise. This is great. Well, not everything turns out great, and as I alluded to before, and I mentioned outright a little bit earlier, not everything turns out great for Joseph. And at least at first. In the end, it does all work out, so that's the spoiler alert. But in this next section, we're going to see that Joseph has to choose to trust God in lousy situations. And we see in the first couple of verses of this section that he really trusts God's direction. And in verses 12 through 17, they say, "Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's fields near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, 'As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, and I am going to send you to them.' 'Very well,' he replied. So he said to them, 'Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me.' Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the fields and asked him, 'What are you looking for?' He replied, 'I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?' 'They have moved on from here,' the man answered. 'I heard them say, let's go to Dothan.' So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan." So now here, even in this section, I think we can see that Joseph is trusting God. I mean, God knows, he knows what Joseph's brothers are planning. I mean, he knows everything. So he would have known that they were planning to kill Joseph, and then that instead of that, they're going to sell him into slavery. But yet God, we see here that he's directing Joseph to go to his brothers through Jacob, Israel, as he was mentioned in these verses, through him. And then also he even provides that stranger. So he's wandering out there looking for his brothers, doesn't exactly know where they are. You know, this is the time before GPS and cell phones and stuff like that. It's harder to find people in the wilderness when you don't know exactly where they are. And so God provides this interaction with a stranger and helps guide them to him, even with that, knowing that plan that Joseph's brothers have, knowing, as we're going to see in the next verse, that they're plotting really to kill him. And God still directs him to go that way, and he trusts God's direction, and he goes that way anyways. And like I said, I don't think Joseph was naive. He was younger, but I don't think he was naive in that he didn't know that his brothers didn't like him. And so it probably would have been a little intimidating to go, meet your 10, 11 other brothers out in the wilderness when you know that they all hate you. And we're really going to see here in the next couple of verses that God works all of that out for good, and that he honors his promises to Abraham, Jacob, and through Joseph and the other brothers. He really honors his promises, and he works everything out for good. So what the brothers intend for bad, for evil, it really does work out to be okay, even if it doesn't look good now. And so that's really the next point, is to expect God's plan to work for good. And verses 18 through 24 say, "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. 'Here comes that dreamer,' they said to each other. 'Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams.' When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. 'Let's not take his life,' he said. 'Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him.' Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it." So here we see the plot. We see that Joseph's brothers here, they want to kill him, and Reuben really convinces them, "Hey, let's not do that. Let's protect him for Dad's sake," and he really wants to save him eventually. And so he's really trying to do a good thing, but the brothers, they don't end up doing that. They throw him into this cistern. It's a bad situation. It goes from really, instead of going from good, bad, worse, it goes worst to kind of bad. He's in the bottom of this giant pit, essentially, that's supposed to hold water, but this one was apparently dry. And he's got all these brothers trying to decide what to do with him. They're going to try and trick their dad into believing that he's dead, the one that he loves. It's going to be devastating. So this is really a terrible thing that the brothers have done. But somewhere in there, Joseph has to expect that God is going to work this out for good, that God is still on his side, and that it's going to be okay. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. I mean, when you're at the bottom of a pit with your brothers all standing around you, trying to figure out, what to do, I don't think it would. I think it would look a little bleak. But I do think that we see that Joseph here, we don't see any fight in him, no resistance. Maybe he tried, but it's not recorded here. And we see this demeanor of just, whatever happens, and he trusts God to work it out for his good. And really, I think he trusts God because of the promises. I don't think he would have been naive to those promises either. I think he would have known about those. I think that's something that maybe Jacob would have shared with his sons. So he would have known about those. And so he also, I think, would have trusted that God would preserve his own. And really, he would preserve his own people. And that's I think, the trust that he holds on to. And we really see that in how this all plays out. Because instead of killing him, they throw him in the pit, and they're trying to decide what to do. And along comes these traders and these people that they can sell him to, and that's what we see them do. So let's read verses 25 through 36. So, as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. And so we see here specifically, his life is now preserved. Verse 28, so when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. And that's chapter 37. So we see that God's going to preserve his people, but this end kind of looks pretty bleak. It doesn't look good. I mean, Joseph, he almost was killed. Instead, he gets sold into slavery. He almost gets left in the pit because they don't really know what to do with him. And then along come those traders, and he gets sold. And then those guys, they go along and they sell him to one of Pharaoh's officials, and that's the captain of the guard, who is Potiphar. And that's the one who eventually accuses him of trying to sleep with his wife, and some not so good things there, and he gets thrown in jail because of it. And there's some other problems that arise because of that as well. And so really we see that God, he's preserving his people. He's preserving his line of promise because he preserves Joseph, and he's going to use Joseph to not only save the land of Egypt, but also to save his family, to protect that line of promise. But that doesn't mean that everything's going to go okay, that everything's going to go well, and it's just going to be all peaches and cream from now on. Just because God's preserving that line of promise. And we see that in Joseph's life. Joseph doesn't exactly have an easy beginning of his life. Maybe he had an easy first, 15 to 17-ish years or so, but it certainly appears that now he's leading a pretty hard life as a young man, where his brothers hate him, his father thinks he's dead, and he's been sold into slavery. But it does, all that to say, that does mean that God has a plan. And we see that because we know that this isn't the end of the story. We can see the rest of the chapters, and we can read those, and we know that this isn't the end of Joseph's story. And so we can see the rest, and we know that God's plan for him is good. And we can know that God's plan for us is good no matter what happens in between. See, God's plan doesn't always have, or it doesn't always include a desirable outcome, or at least in the moment. or situation really, a situation that really is good for us, meaning we're still going to have problems, we're still going to have those trials. Things aren't always going to be good. Things are going to go wrong. So really it leads us to that key question in red at the bottom of the outline. How am I trusting God's plan in every situation? Because in every situation, good or bad. Because it ultimately comes down to that. Am I trusting God no matter what happens? Because we see in the following chapters, if you read them before next week, you'll see that it leads up to chapter 44, and we're really going to skip a bunch of the story there. And we'll talk a little bit about it next week. But if you'll see that those next chapters, that Joseph has more troubles coming up. It's not the end for him. Now, he was spared from being killed, but he's going to be accused of horrible things. We see that he is going to get thrown in jail, stuff like that. And we see that over and over again. He has these troubles, he has these problems, but Joseph really maintains at least from the text, it looks like he's a pleasant person. He has a trusting demeanor. He doesn't get upset at God. He doesn't accuse him for the present situation. Instead, he just trusts him, trusts God in everything. And Joseph's story, as I've mentioned, and I'm trying to prove a point here that his life was pretty hard. And I don't think he deserved those things. He didn't deserve to be sold into slavery. Maybe he was a little annoying about some stuff at times as the little brother, but did he really deserve to be killed or to be sold into slavery? I don't think so. And we know that the next part is that he gets sold. His owner, he loves him at first. He does a great job. Joseph helps him, with a lot of stuff, manages his estate super well. But then the wife essentially accuses Joseph of rape when he tells her no. Instead of and he runs away from her and says, no, I'm not going to sleep with you, and so she goes and is upset, and she tells Potiphar that he did do that, or that he tried to. So then Potiphar has him thrown in jail, understandably so, because who are you going to trust, Joseph or your wife? And so he trusts his wife. And then in jail he meets two of Pharaoh's servants that got thrown in jail for various reasons, and they both have these kind of strange and wild dreams, and they're trying to figure them out, kind of similar to the dreams that Joseph had. And God gives them the ability to interpret those dreams for them. And one of them has kind of a good outcome, and he says, you know what, I'm going to remember you in front of Pharaoh, and I'm going to help you out. And then the other one, not so much. It doesn't end well for him. But the one that it does end well for, he goes back to Pharaoh and totally forgets about Joseph until Pharaoh has a dream. And that dream is the one that talks about the upcoming famine, and but he really doesn't understand it. It's kind of a weird dream with like some 7 fat cows getting eaten by 7 thin cows, and it's kind of weird. It's an interesting story. So if you haven't read that part, I encourage you to go and look at that. It's in between 37 to 44, and just read that whole section. It's an interesting part of the story. And so God gives him, again, the ability to interpret those dreams. And he goes and helps Pharaoh, and he's able to decipher it when all of Pharaoh's other interpreters and his diviners aren't able to. And Joseph attributes that to God. He trusts God's plan, trusts his promise. And then after that, this is where it starts to turn good. Because now Pharaoh's taken notice of him. Joseph has helped him out, and he recognizes that he's a pretty wise guy, even though he's young. And he goes ahead and puts him as the second man in charge of all of Egypt. So he reports directly to Pharaoh. The only one higher than him is Pharaoh. And Joseph is now going to lead this land in right before this famine, and then during the famine, so that they can survive and have enough food to eat during this whole process. And the famine is going to extend far enough that it affects even his family. And so we really see this preservation of not just Joseph, but Joseph's family. So even though the brothers have turned they have this terrible thing that they did, they sold him into slavery, they intended to kill him at first, and then they sell him instead. God uses that, and he redeems that, and he turns it into something good. And that's what we're going to see, we're going to start to see next time, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more. So we're going to skip all the way from chapter 37 to chapter 44. So if you're somebody who likes to plan ahead, that's where we're going next. And then the following week we'll be in chapter 45. But I do encourage you to read those chapters in between so you don't miss out on the cool story and what God's trying to teach us in there as well. But will you pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that you teach us through those words in the Bible. Thank you for the story of Joseph, and that he can help us to understand that he's a good model for us to follow, and that he chose to trust you. And help us to trust you every day, no matter what our situation might be, both good and bad. Thank you that you are the great Redeemer, that you redeem even terrible things and use them to accomplish your purposes and your plan. Help us to trust you more every day. In Jesus' name, amen.